This is the story of two armies that wore the same uniform, fought for the same country, and spent most of the Second World War undermining, resenting, and in some cases, genuinely despising each other. On one side stood the Wehrmacht, Germany's professional military of 18 million men with roots deep in the Prussian officer class, and on the other stood the Waffen-SS, the armed combat wing of Heinrich Himmler's organization, a force that answered not to Germany's military command, but to the Nazi Party itself. The friction between these two institutions is one of the most overlooked tensions of the entire war. And before we get into it, there is something you need to know up front, because this story carries a twist that doubles as one of the biggest historical frauds of the 20th century. After the war ended, former Wehrmacht generals worked systematically to convince the Western world that they had been apolitical professionals, clean soldiers with no connection to Nazi. Atrocities. The SS did it all, the story went. Not us. That narrative shaped public understanding of the war for 50 years, and it is, in large parts, exactly that. A constructed story, built to protect the men who built it. What we will do here is look at the real, documented reasons why Wehrmacht officers distrusted and disliked the SS, some institutional, some professional, some genuinely moral, and then explain why the full picture is considerably darker and more complicated than the version that circulated after 1945. We deal with the fraud directly in this video because you cannot honestly examine the Wehrmacht-SS relationship without confronting the lie that was told about it afterward. To understand why these two forces clashed the way they did, you have to start with what each one actually was and where it came from. The Wehrmacht came into existence in 1935 when Hitler renounced the military restrictions the Treaty of Versailles had placed on Germany. Built directly on the foundations of the Reichswehr, the professional army Germany had maintained since the end of the First World War. That lineage mattered enormously to the officer corps. Wehrmacht officers considered themselves heirs to centuries of Prussian military tradition. Disciplined, formally educated, governed by rigid class conventions, and acutely aware of their own institutional standing. Officers needed at minimum a secondary education to serve. The relationship between officers and enlisted men followed strict formal rules, and this was an institution with an identity, with pride, and with a sharp sense of where it stood in German society. The SS carried none of that history and cared nothing for it. Schutzstaffel, the protection squadron, began in the 1920s as Hitler's personal bodyguard unit, small enough to be nearly irrelevant. Heinrich Himmler transformed it into something else entirely. A vast parallel empire with its own intelligence agencies, its own concentration camp system, its own police formations, and eventually its own armed combat force in the Waffen-SS. The critical thing about all of it, the detail that drove Wehrmacht commanders to distraction, was that the SS answered not to Germany, not to the German military command, but to Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party personally. That was not a bureaucratic technicality. Wehrmacht officers had been trained to think of themselves as servants of the German state, and the SS were servants of a movement, an ideology, and one man, which created a fault line running through every joint operation, every shared supply depot, and every contested battlefield order for the duration of the war. September 1934 is when the conflict began in earnest, the moment Hitler authorized formation of the SS-Verfügungstruppe, the direct forerunner of the Waffen-SS Wehrmacht. Generals moved immediately, demanding oversight, restrictions on how large the SS force could grow, how it would be armed, and how it would fit into the command structure. A compromise was reached, one that satisfied nobody, and Wehrmacht military schools were permitted to train SS officers, a toehold of influence the army clung to while it lasted. When Hitler formally codified the arrangement in August of 1938, the Wehrmacht retained the right to inspect SS combat readiness and budgets. but the SS could procure arms from the Wehrmacht upon payment with no organizational connection between them in peacetime. Then, in February of 1938, the Defense Ministry itself was eliminated and replaced by the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, placed under Hitler's direct personal authority, and whatever institutional leverage the Wehrmacht had been building over the SS evaporated almost overnight. The competition from that point forward was fully underway. Wehrmacht officers did not merely distrust the SS on paper. Many of them openly looked down on it, and that contempt operated at both a cultural and a professional level, with each reinforcing the other. The Wehrmacht's rigid class structure positioned its officer corps as an intellectual and social elite, which made the SS, in their view, an intrusion, a political organization that had dressed itself in military clothing without earning the right to wear it. Behind closed doors, and sometimes not very far behind closed doors at all, Wehrmacht High Command dismissed SS troops as Himmler's asphalt soldiers, meaning party thugs in uniform, not real military men. SS recruitment standards deepened that contempt considerably. Where the Wehrmacht required educational qualifications, the SS emphasized physical ones. Recruits needed to meet specific height requirements: 5 feet 9 inches for standard formations, 5 feet 10 for the prestigious Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. Perfect teeth, 20/20 vision, documented racial purity going back generations. What recruits did not necessarily need was the formal military education Wehrmacht officers considered a baseline for competence, and the Wehrmacht noticed and filed it away. Control of the conscript pipeline gave the Wehrmacht a tool, and they used it deliberately. Official policy routed the best available recruits into the Heer, the Army, and gave the SS the lowest priority for draftee allocation. Beyond that, the Wehrmacht controlled weapons and equipment distribution, and used that control to make the SS wait while their own units received priority. None of this was accidental. It was a calculated strategy to keep the SS small, under-resourced, and dependent on Army goodwill. The SS resented all of it, and they carried a trump card the Wehrmacht could never match: direct personal access to Adolf Hitler. When Himmler wanted something, he did not navigate normal military channels. He walked to the Führer and asked. Wehrmacht generals competing with that arrangement knew they sat at a structural disadvantage, and the knowledge of it made the resentment run deeper on both sides. That dynamic, Wehrmacht institutional power against SS political access, never resolved. It festered through the entire war. All of that theoretical tension became very concrete once the shooting started, and the battlefield relationship between Wehrmacht and SS units generated specific, documented, operational complaints that went well beyond institutional rivalry. After Poland and France, most Wehrmacht officers had formed a clear and unflattering assessment of the Waffen-SS: brave, possibly recklessly so, and poorly led. Wehrmacht tactical doctrine valued calculated advances, coordinated fire and movement, and the careful preservation of fighting strength for the next engagement. The SS operated on different principles entirely, attacking when attack was not warranted, sustaining casualties out of all proportion to the military objectives achieved, and treating those disproportionate losses as a mark of honor rather than a failure of planning. Wehrmacht soldiers who ended up as British prisoners of war were secretly recorded during captivity, and those recordings, later analyzed and published by historians Sönke Neitzel and Harold Welser in their 2012 book Soldaten, captured this contempt in unguarded detail. Wehrmacht men described the SS's willingness to absorb suicidal losses not as heroism, but as tactical incompetence, characterizing the Waffen-SS as a force that embraced costly attacks for little or no military gain. Waffen-SS officer casualty rates throughout the war ran consistently and significantly higher than in the Wehrmacht, which, depending on your perspective, reflects either inspiring courage or catastrophically poor judgment, and quite possibly both. Command structure made all of this worse. On paper, Waffen-SS units placed under Wehrmacht operational control were supposed to follow Wehrmacht tactical authority. In practice, SS commanders treated that authority as optional, partly because their ultimate loyalty ran to Himmler and Hitler rather than to any army general who happened to be in operational command, and Wehrmacht officers who attempted to exercise proper authority over SS units found their orders disputed, delayed, or simply worked around. Yugoslavia in 1941 is where the relationship reached what historians have called rock bottom, when SS troops threatened to open fire on Wehrmacht columns during operations there. German soldiers threatening to shoot other German soldiers in the middle of a campaign. That tells you something concrete about how deep the dysfunction had gone. Belgrade produced its own strange episode when Wehrmacht and SS units raced each other to capture the Yugoslav capital in April of 1941. An absurd competition in the middle of what was supposed to be a coordinated military operation. SS officer Fritz Klingenberg, a Hauptsturmführer in the 2nd SS Panzerdivision Das Reich, won the race by capturing the entire city with just 6 men bluffing the garrison into surrender. Audacious, certainly, but the kind of freelance operation Wehrmacht commanders found infuriating because it prioritized SS prestige over coordinated military action. Legal recourse was another thing Wehrmacht commanders simply did not have, because on October 4, 1939, Hitler had issued an order removing SS units from Wehrmacht military court jurisdiction in Poland. If SS personnel committed offenses affecting Wehrmacht operations or personnel, the Army had no mechanism for charging or disciplining them. They could take it to Himmler and hope he chose to act. Meanwhile, the SS kept growing. From 3 regiments at the start of the war, the Waffen-SS expanded to 38 or 39 full divisions by war's end, and by early 1944, despite representing less than 5% of Wehrmacht manpower overall, they controlled roughly 1/4 of all panzer divisions and approximately 1/3 of all panzer grenadier divisions. The Wehrmacht had spent years trying to limit the SS in its early stages and now found itself fighting alongside a force that had grown into a major armored power regardless. Hitler reportedly planned, after a German victory, to replace the Wehrmacht entirely with the Waffen-SS, and Wehrmacht officers who were aware of this had every reason to regard the SS not merely as a rival, but as an organization whose long-term goal was to make them obsolete. Now we reach the part of this story most often cited and most often misrepresented, the question of whether Wehrmacht officers objected to the SS on moral grounds, and what those objections actually amounted to. General Johannes Blaskowitz is the most documented case. Appointed Commander-in-Chief of occupied Poland in October of 1939, immediately after the German conquest, Blaskowitz filed multiple written memoranda to Wehrmacht High Command between November 1939 and February 1940, documenting in systematic detail what SS and police units were doing to the Polish civilian population: mass executions, rape, plunder on a massive scale, and the damage all of it was doing to his own troops. One memorandum described the attitude of Wehrmacht troops toward the SS and police as alternating between abhorrence and hatred. Blaskowitz warned the atrocities were destroying military discipline. His soldiers were witnessing mass killings and coming away with rising alcoholism, venereal disease, and a deteriorating sense of order. With striking prescience, he warned that an organization capable of this behavior against foreign civilians might eventually turn against the German people themselves. His most detailed memorandum landed on Hitler's desk on February 6, 1940. Hitler called Blaskowitz's concerns childish and mocked what he described as his Salvation Army attitude. Blaskowitz was placed on a blacklist, and his career ended. General Georg von Küchler faced similar consequences for similar protests. Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, complained directly to Colonel General Alfred Jodl on September 12, 1939, about SS operations in Poland. And those complaints went nowhere. At the individual level, there were acts of genuine moral courage. Wehrmacht Reserve Officer Albert Battelle, stationed in Przemysl, placed his troops physically between an SS detachment and the Jewish ghetto, blocking a planned massacre and threatening to open fire on the SS if they proceeded. Yad Vashem later honored him as one of the righteous among the nations. These examples are real, they are documented, and they deserve to be acknowledged. But here is where history forces the complication. When you examine most Wehrmacht objections to SS conduct closely, including Blaskowitz's own memoranda, the framing is almost never primarily moral. It is operational. The argument is not, what you are doing is wrong and must stop. The argument is, what you are doing is creating military problems for us and damaging Germany's reputation. Blaskowitz was not calling for the protection of Polish Jews on the grounds that it was right. He was arguing that the atrocities were undermining troop discipline and generating resistance that would make occupation harder to manage. That distinction matters enormously, and it leads directly to the darkest part of this story. When the war ended in May of 1945, the surviving German military leadership faced a genuine reckoning. The Nuremberg trials were coming. The crimes of the Nazi regime were being documented on an industrial scale, and former Wehrmacht officers needed a way to survive, professionally and legally, in the post-war world. What they built was one of the most successful disinformation campaigns of the 20th century. Franz Halder, former chief of the Wehrmacht General Staff, led a group of former generals writing historical accounts for the United States Army's Historical Division after the war. Halder's instructions to his writers were explicit. Portray the German army as honorable professional soldiers who had been Hitler's reluctant instruments, offer no criticism of measures ordered by the leadership, and ensure that no one among the Wehrmacht officer corps was incriminated in any way. All crimes, the narrative would declare, belonged to the SS. That story found a receptive audience in the West. The Cold War had begun. American military leaders wanted German generals as partners against the Soviet Union, and former Wehrmacht officers were recruited into NATO planning. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the honorable army that had fought hard and fought well with nothing to do with Nazi atrocities, settled into Western popular understanding and stayed there for decades, reinforced by memoirs, films, and television. The problem was that the myth was not true. By 1941, approximately one-third of junior Wehrmacht officers had joined the Nazi Party, and among senior officers, the figure sat at nearly 30%. The Yabaist Kommissar Order, the directive to execute all captured Soviet political officers rather than treating them as prisoners of war, was issued by the Wehrmacht's own high command, not by the SS. The Barbarossa Jurisdiction Decree, which suspended the normal rules of war on Operation Barbarossa and the Eastern Front and gave German soldiers effective license to kill civilians, was also a Wehrmacht document. As documented by military historian Omer Bartov and other scholars, the Holocaust on the Eastern Front unfolded in a framework of Wehrmacht cooperation. When SS Einsatzgruppen operated behind German lines in the Soviet Union, they did so with Wehrmacht logistical support, Wehrmacht security cooperation, and in many cases, Wehrmacht active participation. At Babi Yar on September 29th and 30th of 1941, 33,771 Jewish men, women, and children were murdered in 2 days. SS units carried it out, but Wehrmacht General Kurt Eberhard at Kyiv cooperated enthusiastically and provided an army propaganda company to help lure the victims to the site. The fate of Soviet prisoners tells perhaps the starkest story. Approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers fell into German captivity during the war, and roughly 3 million of them, nearly 58%, died in German hands, killed by starvation, disease, and deliberate exposure. The Wehrmacht controlled those camps, and Wehrmacht policy decisions produced those deaths. Compare that to approximately 3% of British and American prisoners who died in German captivity, and what emerges is not a consequence of chaotic wartime conditions. It was policy, set and enforced by the regular German army. The myth held in the West until 1995, when an exhibition called Verbrechen der Wehrmacht, also known as the Wehrmacht Exhibition, opened in Germany and used photographs, documents, and testimony to document direct Wehrmacht participation in atrocities across occupied Europe and the Soviet Union. The exhibition was fiercely controversial in Germany, provoking protests, political battles, and public argument because it attacked something many Germans had spent 50 years believing about their fathers and grandfathers. Some specific claims were later revised after historical review, but the central argument that the Wehrmacht was deeply implicated in Nazi crimes and that the clean Wehrmacht story was false has been confirmed by decades of subsequent historical scholarship. What this means for our subject is straightforward. When former Wehrmacht officers talked about how much they had hated working with the SS, and some of that hatred was genuine, part of what they were doing was weaponizing a real institutional rivalry to construct a false alibi for their own crimes. A few specific details from this story deserve their own moment, because they capture the full strangeness of what this rivalry actually looked like in practice. Every Waffen-SS member carried a blood type tattooed on the underside of their left upper arm, placed there for a practical medical reason. Field surgeons needed to identify blood types quickly in combat. After the war, that tattoo became one of the most reliable tools for identifying former SS members during Allied screenings, and many former SS personnel tried to burn or cut it off before surrendering. The attempt to remove it frequently made them more conspicuous rather than less. The SS Nord Division, deployed to Finland in 1941 for operations against Soviet forces, suffered a significant defeat, pushed back with heavy casualties, and the German public was never told. The episode was suppressed entirely because admitting that one of Himmler's elite formations had performed embarrassingly would have punctured the carefully maintained image of SS invincibility. Warsaw in 1944 produced a situation that illustrated just how far outside any recognizable military conduct things could go. The 36th Waffen-SS Division, commanded by Oskar Dirlewanger, a convicted sex offender, was deployed during the Warsaw Uprising, its ranks filled with convicted criminals of various kinds. Dirlewanger's unit's conduct during the uprising was so extreme that Army commanders and SS commanders alike demanded the unit's removal from operations. When the SS was complaining about another SS unit's behavior, you have a useful measure of exactly how bad things had gotten. Kassel Iter, Austria, May 5, 1945. 5 days after Adolf Hitler's suicide and 3 days before Germany's formal surrender, produced one of the strangest military engagements of the entire war. American soldiers and Wehrmacht troops fought side by side against attacking SS holdouts to defend a castle holding French Pfeiffarmsp prisoners, including former prime ministers. Wehrmacht Major Josef Gangl, who had secretly joined the Austrian resistance by that point, died in the battle, killed by SS fire while shielding former French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud from the gunshots. In the war's final hours, Wehrmacht soldiers died fighting the SS to protect Allied prisoners. The popular belief that the SS always received the best equipment, the newest tanks, priority allocations, turns out to be an oversimplification. A detailed examination of armored vehicle allocation records finds no clear pattern of systematic SS favoritism. The Wehrmacht generally received new weapon systems first, with the SS sometimes waiting months for equivalent equipment. What the SS did maintain was a completely separate supply chain, entirely independent from Wehrmacht logistics, and during joint operations that independence created constant coordination problems. Two parallel supply systems, incompatible administrative processes, and competing demands at the same railheads and depots. So let's bring this back to where it started. The Wehrmacht and the SS hated working together, and that animosity had several distinct roots operating at different levels and meaning different things to different people. Institutional rivalry was real and structural. A professional military organization watching a political paramilitary force grow into a competing army, pulling away resources, recruits, and Hitler's attention, threatening to replace the Wehrmacht entirely after a German victory. Professional contempt was real too, rooted in the Wehrmacht officer corps' view of itself as an educated elite, and its view of the SS as glorified party militia. Some of that contempt was earned, in the sense that early SS tactical performance genuinely reflected recklessness and disproportionate casualties. Some of it was class-based snobbery with nothing to do with actual military competence. Command friction was constant and grinding, the day-to-day operational difficulty of running joint operations with an organization that reported to different authority, maintained separate logistics, sat outside military justice, and had a habit of running its own agenda in the middle of shared battlefields. And moral horror, in some documented cases, was real. Blaskowitz's career ended because he filed those memoranda. Albert Batel put his men between SS troops and a Jewish ghetto. These people were real, and what they did mattered. But the complication that history will not allow us to avoid is this. Most Wehrmacht objections to SS conduct were framed in operational terms, not ethical ones. And after the war, the entire body of Wehrmacht complaints about the SS, real complaints, genuine grievances, was systematically weaponized to construct a false narrative that shifted blame for the crimes of the Nazi regime onto the SS, while the regular German army walked away from the historical record with its reputation artificially intact. The Wehrmacht hated fighting alongside the SS. That hatred was genuine, but it grew far more from competition and professional pride than from moral principle, and the same officers who complained most bitterly about SS behavior were in many cases signing the Commissar orders, cooperating with the Einsatzgruppen, and bearing direct responsibility for the deaths of millions of Soviet prisoners of war. Holding both of those things simultaneously is not comfortable, but it is what the evidence requires. The rivalry was real. The shared crimes were real. And the story that was told afterward to separate the two was, in large part, a lie. The Wehrmacht and the SS hated each other, and they destroyed Europe together. If you watch this to the end, thank you for staying with it. This is a subject that gets harder to summarize the more closely you look at it, which is usually a sign that it's worth the time. The history of the Second World War continues to be refined as archives open and new research accumulates. The clean Wehrmacht myth, which shaped Western understanding of the war for half a century, has now been thoroughly dismantled by professional historians, and the fuller picture, that responsibility for the crimes of the Nazi regime, was widely distributed across German institutions, not concentrated in one organization, is better established now than at any previous point. That matters, not because it changes what happened, but because understanding how ordinary institutions and ordinary people participated in extraordinary crimes is one of the most important things history can actually teach us. Thanks for watching.